200 tapes at least. All of them are C-SPAN. We're going to look at them when we retire.
When we get old.
For 25 years, cable's gift to America.
This week on Booknotes, our guest is Harvard University professor Samuel Huntington. He joins us to discuss his book, Who Are We? The Challenges to America's National Identity.
Samuel P. Huntington, author of Who Are We? What's the book about?
The book is about America, and you'll notice that it is a question, and it's a question which I grapple with in the book as to what American national identity means, how it has changed over the years.
Before I ask you about this book, I want to bring folks up to date on where you've come from. The book that you can read most about in your life is, and I know there have been several. Yes. By the way, what book is this for you that you've just written?
Oh, well, it's hard to say, 12th or 15th or something like that, because I've edited books and written books and co-authored books and so forth.
The book called The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, what year did it come out?
1996.
And what was it about?
Well, it was basically about the nature of post-Cold War global politics. During the Cold War and during most of the 20th century, in addition to power playing a role in international relations, ideology played a role in international relations. And what I argue in this book on the Clash of Civilizations is that ideology is out now, it is not important, but culture is, and civilizations are the broadest cultural entities in the world, and we have maybe 8 or so major civilizations, and that international politics now is being shaped by the interactions among these civilizations, and cultural factors are playing a role in shaping the patterns of alliances and antagonisms among states, much as ideology did in the 20th century.
You made some people mad, some people very mad, and Edward Said, who's now deceased, wrote a piece in The Nation magazine. He didn't like the fact that you put the West against Islam.
Well, I am very careful in the book not to divide the world in two. And as a matter of fact, I quote Said approvingly on this point in the book. And I see global politics as being interactions among these 8 or so major civilizations. And obviously Islam and the West are two of the most important, and their relations over the centuries since the past 1,300 years or so have varied. At times they've been peaceful, at other times there's been conflict, and clearly there is a very important Islamic resurgence going on in the world now, as Muslims from Morocco straight through to Indonesia are becoming more and more conscious of their Islamic identity and are asserting it in a variety of ways, and some of which, but only a small part of which, are violent. And that is why we are seeing this militant Islamic extremism manifest itself.
Where were you on September the 11th?
I was on my way to Washington.
To do what?
Flying from Boston to Washington for a board meeting of a foundation I'm involved in, and I had the chilling thought. I realized later that the terrorists in Boston's Logan Airport were there at exactly the same time I was, and but happily taking another plane. But that was quite a day.
Well, at what point were you in the air? Had it happened already?
No.
You were earlier.
Yeah.
And then,
well, it began happening just as we arrived, and when we got to this meeting, somebody had the TV on, and we all became fixated on that.
When did you first learn who did it?
Oh, I can't remember that. I mean, it was.
I guess
the news came out, scattered in such a scattered fashion. One plane had crashed. Something that may have happened to another plane, and then the second plane went into the World Trade Center. And when that happened, everybody said, this isn't an accident.
My real question, though, was when you first learned that there were Arabs involved and fundamentalists? Were you surprised?
Well, I was shocked, and now, of course, we knew that Al-Qaeda had been responsible for earlier attacks on the United States, including one on the World Trade Center. So when you put it in that context, the basis for surprise diminished considerably.
Well, I guess I was really asking in conjunction with the book, The Clash of the Civilizations, did that just make sense to you then, based on what your own theory was?
Well, unfortunately, yes. And like most of my books that I've written in the past, what I tend to do in my books, and this is true of Who Are We, is to look at situations and analyze phenomena which, for one reason or another, people are uneasy with or don't want to focus on or want to avoid. This was true in my first book on the soldier and the state, and it was denounced because I said, well, we got to work out a new way of handling civil-military relations in this country. But after a few years, it became the accepted book on civil-military relations, and is still in print now after 30 years or more, and is commonly referred to as the classic work. And I think this book, The Clash of Civilizations, was attacked by a variety of people when it first came out, as was my Foreign Affairs article, which came out 4 years before on the same subject. But since September 11th, people have been applying the adjective prescient to The Clash of Civilizations book. And as I say, it's unfortunate that it turned out to be relevant, so relevant now.
How did you get into this business?
This business being what?
Well, several things. Teaching, one, and writing books that people will read.
Well, I went to Yale as an undergraduate, then into the Army, then a year at the University of Chicago, then went to Harvard.
What year did you go to Harvard?
In 1948. I was a graduate student. I was relatively young at that point. I went to graduate work in political science, international relations, because as a result of World War II, when I was a young teenager, this suddenly struck me that international relations was a very important subject, and so I have pursued that ever since, and have written a variety of books and other things on it. Teach courses.
Where did you grow up?
In New York City, in Astoria, in Queens. Went through the New York City public schools.
What about your parents? What did they do?
Well, my father grew up on a farm in Maine and came down to New York and went to the Columbia School of Journalism and became an editor of publications dealing with the hotel industry.
And the Huntington name, well, before we do that, your mother.
Well, she grew up in New York City and was a short story writer.
The Huntington name, how far back does it go in America?
Well, Simon and Margaret Huntington sailed from England to the United States in 1633. They were part of a group of settlers from Norwich, England, who arrived in Boston and then went on to found Norwich, Connecticut. Simon died on the way over, but there were 4 sons, and almost all Huntingtons in the United States are descended from those 4 sons.
Is there a large Huntington family that you're connected to?
Well, not intimately, no. I've some close, very few close Huntington relatives, but there's a huge Huntington conglomerate all told with. There's a Huntington Family Association, which tries to maintain contact with among the Huntingtons and so forth and so on.
You have been a Harvard professor for how many years?
I guess going on 50. I started teaching at Harvard full-time in 1950. And then became an assistant professor. But then when I came up for promotion to tenure, I was turned down, in part as a result of that first book I mentioned, The Soldier and the State, which infuriated some of the faculty members. And so I went off and taught at Columbia for 4 years, and then Harvard saw the error of its ways and persuaded me to come back. And so I'm just at 50 years total at Harvard.
And are you currently teaching?
Oh, yes. Yeah, full load.
Do colleges make decisions about whether to give tenure to professors based on what they think, what side they're on?
Well, they shouldn't, and all sorts of things obviously come into tenure decisions. I think certainly at a place like Harvard, merit far excels anything else, and that has become more and more the case over the decades. Back in the 1950s, when I was turned down for tenure, it was much more of a personal sort of decision. People, the senior professors making the decision would at times certainly make decisions on whether you just liked a person or not on the quality of the work.
What did you do in the Carter administration?
I had the title of Coordinator of Security Planning at the National Security Council, working with my friend Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the National Security Assistant to Carter. And Brzezinski, when he was appointed, asked me to come down and work with him, which I did for 2 years.
What did you do in the Johnson administration?
In the Johnson administration, I was a consultant to the State Department, and in particular to the Policy Planning Council, and was asked to write a report on the problems of getting political stability in South Vietnam. This was at the height of the war in 1967. And so I went out and spent a couple of months in South Vietnam and traveled around and came back and wrote a report, which I think was one of the more damning documents as far as our then policy was concerned. I remember briefing one group of people on it, and the top person in the White House concerned with Vietnam, when I had finished, said, "Well, if what you say is right, everything we're doing is wrong." So,
you worked with Henry Kissinger in the past?
I don't think I've ever really worked with Henry Kissinger.
Did you teach together?
No, but I've known Henry for decades and decades. Yeah, he's a good friend.
Because he endorses your book.
Yes, yeah. Well,
this book, Who Are We, has what premise?
Well, the basic reason I wrote it is that it seemed to me in the 1990s, looking at what was going on in this country at that time, that there were various challenges to American national identity that had developed, a whole variety of different ones. And I think that one could argue that there had been some core elements in American national identity. I identify 4 in the book that were present historically, that these were race, ethnicity, culture and what is generally called the American creed, a set of values and political beliefs articulated by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence and by many other leading figures. Happily, race and ethnicity, which were central for a couple of centuries at least in defining America, have faded and just about disappeared. And that leaves us with our culture and our creed, and I argue that the creed is a product of the culture, and hence the attacks on the culture or changes in our culture could be of some consequence. And one of the important distinctions I make in the book, I think, is that between settlers and immigrants, because we always refer to ourselves as, like to refer to ourselves as a nation of immigrants, and that's true, but it's a partial truth. Immigrants are people who go from one society to another society. There has to be a recipient society. And I argue that the basic American culture was brought over in the 17th and 18th century by people from Britain, and it had these these British origins, and it was basically, I argue, an Anglo-Protestant culture, because America was 98% Protestant country in the 17th and 18th century, and these were dissident Protestants by and large, who were leaving in part because they were persecuted in Britain, and the ideas and values and culture and institutions and customs they brought with them have been the core culture of the United States. Now, obviously, there are all sorts of other cultures here, subcultures, but most countries do have something that could be called the mainstream or core culture, and it seems to me that over the years, our core culture has been this Anglo-Protestant culture of the original settlers, although obviously it's evolved and changed and been affected by the waves of immigration that we've had, who've contributed to it in a whole variety of positive ways. But it still is basically the culture of the original settlers.
So today, what's the real difference in this country? For instance, you point out in your book that there are 38 million Mexican Americans.
Well, no, 38 million Hispanics, I think.
Hispanics.
Yeah. A large portion of which are
Mexicans. Okay, what impact has that had on us?
Well, I think the Mexican immigration and the Hispanic immigration generally during the periods since the 1960s is a phenomenon we've never really had before. We've had previous waves of immigrants in the mid-19th century and in the decades before World War I. After World War I, we pretty much shut down immigration. Congress passed very restrictive laws. But then in the 1960s, I think very happily we opened up, changed those laws, and the laws that were enacted, the Immigration Act, weren't supposed to have quite the effect which they did have, but they opened the door to this very widespread immigration that we've had since the mid-60s, and a heavy component of that has been the Hispanic and particularly Mexican immigration. And this is the first time in our history that we have had a majority of the immigrants coming into this country speaking a single non-English language.
You have some statistics that you use in the book. In the 1960s, we had 3.3 million immigrants. 1980s, 7 million immigration, and in 1990s, 9 million. And you say that in the 60s, foreign-born...
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
In the 60s, foreign-born were 5.3% of the population, and today, 2002 roughly, 11.5%.
That's right, yeah.
Good or bad for us?
Well, I think basically immigration is good. It has been essential, as I point out in the book, to the development of America, and immigrants have made tremendous contributions to our success in economically and in science and technology and exploration, and have greatly contributed to our playing a positive role in the world. In the past, however, immigration has always been accompanied by assimilation. And I think the problem now comes not from immigration per se, but to the extent that there is a problem, it comes from the extent to which recent immigrants, particularly Hispanics, do not seem to be assimilating in the same way in which immigrants have in the past. Now, maybe the process will just be slower. It certainly will be different, but there are a whole variety of factors in American society that contribute to this difference, as well as the differences in the nature of the immigrants. Previous immigrants in the 19th, early 20th centuries had to make a real commitment to come here. It was tough during the 19th century in particular. Great risks involved, large numbers, a good percentage of people died on the ships coming over to America, so that involved a very definite commitment. Now, immigrants don't have to make that sort of a commitment, and we have the phenomenon of what I call ampersands, people who have two nationalities, two homes in different countries, and increasingly two citizenships. And it seems to me the whole question of dual citizenship, which we've had some of in the past, but which in theory we're not supposed to have, but that has become a widespread phenomenon now. And so in a whole variety of ways, it seems to me this new immigration raises differences and potentially problems.
There's and I should have gotten the title of it as we're taping this. There's a movie out that suggests that, I'm not sure the exact premise, but has something to do with taking Mexicans out of the California system for a day and see what happens. And it's actually the creator of it is, I think, a Mexican American. Yeah. Just to see that. Yeah. A lot of things that are
California
done.
would grind to a stop. I don't think there's any doubt about that, because Hispanics, mostly Mexicans in California, make up a huge proportion of California population. And as I say, immigration, it seems to me, is essential. Now, there's a special problem with Mexican immigration, because such a large proportion of it is illegal. And we've never had that before. The common estimate of the number of illegal immigrants coming into this country each year ranges up to about 350,000 per year. We take in maybe 800,000 legal immigrants each year, and so we have a million more than a million new people coming into this country, and the problem, I think, the problem of the illegal immigration is a very, very serious one, and the estimates now are we have 9 or 10 million illegal immigrants in the country.
So, what should be done? I mean,
it's difficult, and it's been particularly difficult, obviously, in trying to control illegal immigration from Mexico, which is the principal source of illegal immigration. And there have been various efforts to do this. Congress passed an Immigration Reform Act in the mid-1980s, which provided an amnesty and gave legal status to almost 3 million illegal immigrants who were here then. And that was accompanied by provisions for to try to limit illegal immigration and provide penalties on employers who hired illegal immigrants and a whole variety of other things. But it didn't have that effect because those provisions weren't enforced, and the fact that Congress had voted an amnesty for illegal immigrants made illegal immigration that much more attractive to other potential immigrants. And so illegal immigration went up, it didn't go down. And President Bush has just proposed legislation to try to deal with this. And I give him credit for proposing the legislation, but I don't think it will pass, and I don't think it will really solve the problem, because essentially it too is an amnesty. And as I say, the record shows that amnesties don't deter people; they encourage people to come.
You suggested by some year in the middle 2000s that this country, whites will be in the minority.
Well, I don't suggest it. The census projections say that by the year 2050, non-Hispanic whites will be about 50% of the population.
And is there anything wrong with that?
No, I have nothing against the changing racial makeup of the country. I have no concern about people's color. I do have concerns about their values and culture and commitment and those sorts of things. But whether they're black, brown, white, or whatever, yellow, it seems to me doesn't make any difference and shouldn't make any difference.
You also write about the history of history being taught.
Yeah, right.
How long has it been taught in this country?
Well, when you say the history of history, I'm not quite sure what you're getting.
Well, you write about that. You know, we haven't taught history forever to students in the country, and that
we haven't taught American history.
Yeah, then it varies in over the time, and as far as how interested people are in it. I mean, just ask you, how interested are we today in American history?
Well, I think what you had here is that the history of the United States and of America as a society and a country didn't really appear in terms of books or courses in schools or colleges until after the Civil War. History, with one major exception, the histories that were written before the Civil War were devoted to localities and states. There wasn't, in any real sense, a national history. And before the Civil War, the issue as to whether we were a nation was up for grabs. It was debated. It wasn't clear that we were a nation. And it was the Civil War, as Emerson and various other people said, that really made us a nation. And after that, we began to have a national history and a focus on national history. And the century from the 1860s to the 1960s was a century of American nationalism. That was when we became Americans became very nationalistic and identified with their country, and among other things, promoted national history and glorified the Pilgrim Fathers and the Founding Fathers and the whole panoply of heroes and wars that we had fought and so forth and so on. Then in the 1960s, with the rise of multiculturalism and a variety of other developments, national history began to fade. And so increasingly, we have seen emphasis upon the histories of ethnic groups and racial groups and other subgroups, which had been certainly neglected during the period of nationalism. But now I think there's a fair amount of evidence that indicates, at least in a large number of schools in particular and in some colleges, that national history is neglected and has given way to the history of particular groups in our society.
Why is that happening?
Well, it's a result of this intellectual movement that developed in the 1960s. that reacted against the what was at times certainly the overemphasis on nationalism. I think it was affected, of course, by the Vietnam War attitudes of people, and it was in a way a rather bizarre product of the civil rights movement. And the civil rights legislation in the mid-1960s was passed because the whole effort devoted to getting it passed was saying this is a tremendous violation. The situation of blacks in this country being discriminated against and segregated and so forth. This violates the American creed, the principles of basic equality on which this country is founded. And as a result, we passed the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act in the mid-1960s. But as soon as they were passed, then the blacks and other groups began claiming special privileges for themselves as groups, not as individuals. And this let loose this whole series of efforts by a whole variety of racial groups, ethnic groups, women, of course, to demanding more attention to themselves. And I think that was the result of, that produced the result of this replacement of the national history as it had been taught previously, but with the history of particular groups.
If in our American creed we believe so much in equality, why did we let slavery happen?
Well, that was the great anomaly, of course. And Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration, of course, was a slave owner, as well as most of the other people from the South in this country for down until the Civil War. Most of the leading people in the South, and this was the great incongruity I think slavery appeared, of course, in the 17th century when we were, in terms of harvesting tobacco and cotton and other crops, it was through the plantation system. This was an extremely efficient and profitable way of making money. And of course, slavery was prevalent throughout most of the world at that period of time too. And it's as I say, the great incongruity. And happily, we finally got rid of it, and now we have finally also got, after a century since the Civil War, have pretty much gotten rid of discrimination based on race.
Is there any chance that Thomas Jefferson and the Founding Fathers really didn't believe in equality for everybody? They believed in equality for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants?
Well, that was certainly, in effect, what they did. And you have many people, of course, and the U.S. Supreme Court in one notable case saying, you know, blacks really aren't like us. And this is part of the racism that existed and was so important throughout much of our history. And of course, racist ideology could be used and was used to justify the suppression of blacks. And then in the late 19th century, we moved on and began to exclude Asians, beginning in the 1880s. And the argument there was, well, they're not like us either. They can't assimilate into our culture and society. When they come here, they live off by themselves in their own Asian ghettos and don't really become Americans. And so by World War I, we had legislation that pretty much excluded any immigration from Asia. This was we really defined ourselves as a white country, and that goes back to the first Naturalization Act, which was passed in 1790, which provided that only free white persons could be naturalized as American citizens.
So is there any way you can convince the Hispanic that comes to this country, especially the Mexican that comes over the border, that it's worth learning our history, it's worth speaking English, and it's worth being loyal to this country? Or is it just going to, in your opinion, going to keep going in the wrong direction?
I think the immigrants who come from Mexico are overwhelmingly loyal in some sense to the U.S. Most of them say they want to go back to Mexico, and as I said, given the fact that Mexico is contiguous, it is very easy for people to maintain connections and almost commute back and forth. And I had one student a couple of years ago who did a study on one particular plant in Nebraska, most of whose employees were from a single village in Mexico, and they were all part of one community and went back and forth. And it was, as you said, that people just commute to Nebraska to work and go back home and so forth. This is very different from what we've had in the past, and I think it's something that isn't obviously limited to the United States. I mean, globalization and all the improvements in transportation and communication make it very possible to do that, and I doubt that sort of thing can be stopped or that it should be stopped, but it's something we have to, it seems to me, to take into consideration in thinking about what it means to be American.
As you know, people that watch you from afar, journalists and others, see mixed signals coming, including the interview that you did recently in the New York Times Magazine. And I brought along to read it so that I could ask you about this.
Okay.
This is from Deborah Solomon.
Yes.
What political party do you belong to? You answered, I'm an old-fashioned Democrat. I was dead set against going into Iraq.
Right.
She asked, will you vote for Kerry then?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I've met him several times. He lives a few blocks away from me on Beacon Hill. She says, how can you reconcile being a Democrat with your views on immigration and assimilation? And you say, actually, both parties are divided on immigration, and as a scholar, I have responsibility to study society and to try to call people's attention to things they might not welcome looking at.
Right. Well, in that final answer, over my vigorous objections, they deleted my first sentence, which was, I am in favor of immigration, but it has to be immigration with assimilation.
Why would the New York Times do that to you?
Well, you have to ask the New York Times, but...
Did they let you see the interview before it ran?
Well, no, I didn't see it, but I insisted that I have a chance to look at, to hear, at any rate. They wouldn't. They said they couldn't send it to me. And with that question, I said, look, I want to make it clear, I'm not opposed to immigration per se. I'm in favor of immigration. It's been important. I say it's more important earlier in the interview, but it has to be immigration with assimilation. And also, of course, as I point out, I'm married to the daughter of an immigrant, an Armenian immigrant.
Well, the other image, though, is that conservatives have liked you over the years. You've been associated from time to time, I think, with the American Enterprise Institute.
Yeah, which is...
well, let me just finish. And also, you have been funded for years by the John M. Olin Foundation.
Yeah.
And sometimes by the Bradley Foundation.
Sure.
And sometimes by the Smith Richardson
Yes.
Foundation, which some people view as conservatives. And...
Well, the Ford Foundation is a liberal foundation.
I know, but you know what I mean, though. I mean, the mixed views on how's that all fit together? Being a liberal Democrat that's going to vote for John Kerry and being supported.
Well, I never said I was a liberal. I'm not. I view myself as a conservative, and I think the foundations you mentioned, who have provided funding for various projects, many projects at Harvard, many excellent programs at Harvard, including programs I have been involved in, are very respectable foundations. And certainly award grants on the basis of expertise and the probability of the project that's going to be funded, producing some significant work, and they have funded a good portion of my work.
So Harvard's not, they're not anti-conservative.
Well, I'm not going to judge Harvard, but and I think it is certainly true, and I have some figures on academic political views in the book that Harvard faculty are overwhelmingly liberal and overwhelmingly democratic. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
You say that this is two different countries, elite and non-elite. What's the difference? Who are the elites and what are the different worlds?
I don't think I say they're two different countries. They're two different groups. Obviously, in every society, there are the leaders and the people who have power and money and influence and play the major role in shaping events in the society. And then the great bulk of the people who work and hopefully earn a living and also contribute to the society, but don't play a leading role. And one of the points I make in the book, of course, is that the American public, in terms of comparative public opinion surveys looking at a whole variety of countries, are among the most patriotic people in the world. But in recent years, we have seen some segments of American elites become what I say denationalized. They're shifting their identities and loyalties away from this country, becoming cosmopolitan, transnational, defining themselves very explicitly as citizens of the world who just happen to have an American passport. This, again, is a result of this whole process of globalization. Our big corporations, who used to think of themselves exclusively as American corporations, now think of themselves as multinational global corporations. And act accordingly. They're operating on a global basis. This is somewhat parallel to what happened in this country in industrialization after the Civil War, where businesses suddenly realized they couldn't just operate in one city and sell their products there. They had to operate increasingly on a national basis, and businesses had to form national corporations. And now we're having American corporations operate globally and think globally. And of course, something I don't get into the book, in the book, is this has economic consequences in what is now commonly referred to as the outsourcing of jobs. If they can get people to do the same work that American workers to do at a small fraction of what they have to pay American workers, they are moving their activities overseas.
Who best, as long as this is a political year, who best then is recognizing these future problems, the John Kerry versus the George Bush? And if you're conservative, why wouldn't you be a George Bush fan?
Well, I think when I say I'm conservative, what I think you have to ask anybody who says they're conservatives, okay, what do they want to conserve? And I want to conserve American society as it has evolved, and American culture, and develop it. Obviously, it has to change, but basically, that's what I'm interested in conserving. And American society, culture, and particularly our political institutions, are of course very liberal in their substance. But that's what it seems to me a real conservative should want to preserve. And I'm not going to make any judgments on Kerry and Bush as to how they would rate when judged in that way, though.
Well, guess what I wanted to ask your opinion on is, do people say they're liberals or conservatives, say they're Republicans or Democrats? Yeah. Do either one of those mean anything in today? And do people follow someone? Well,
there's all this problem of when you talk about liberalism and conservatism in the United States, that in our popular discussion and so forth, define those terms very differently from the way in which they were historically defined in Europe. As many scholars have pointed out, all Americans are liberal, including whether it's George Bush or people to the right of George Bush, are liberal in the European sense. Neo-capitalists are certainly the epitome of European liberalism. But we think of them as conservative. And liberals are people who promote government involvement in the economy to help poorer people and provide services and so forth and so on. And it seems to me all of these groups, however, have an appropriate role to play in our society.
And you talk a little bit about this in the book. In Germany, do the Germans insist that the Turks speak German, and in France the Algerians speak French, and the Pakistanis do speak English in Britain, but you see where I'm getting at. The Koreans speak Japanese in Japan. What kind of an insistence is there around the world about assimilation in those places?
Well, I think the European countries have a much greater problem with assimilation because they don't have the same immigrant experience that we have had, certainly not to the same extent. And so with the Turks in Germany or with the North Africans in France, there's been a tendency for them to go off and live in encapsulated communities and not to really assimilate. Now, obviously, people who are born of Turkish parents in Germany or Algerian parents in France learn German and French, but the communities still remain very separate, and this is a real problem for those countries. Because Germans have historically defined their identity by ancestry. You're a German if you had German parents. Well, the Turks don't have German parents, and only now, recently, in the past few years, has Germany begun to change its citizenship laws to facilitate people of Turkish ancestry born in Germany becoming full German citizens.
Based on what you know of history, where are we headed? Where do you think we will be in, pick the year, 25 years from now? What will this country be?
Well, I don't know. That's the reason there's a question mark after my title. I know where I hope we will be. I hope I outline in the book various possibilities. One would be a society in which did not have a common culture, but just had the creed, would be, in a sense, a creedal society. And but I have grave doubts as to whether such a society can really maintain unity. It seems to me a country has to be something more than simply a set of political principles.
What's in that American creed?
Well, all the truths we hold self-evident in terms of equality, individualism, liberty, democracy, due process of law.
Do we deserve, what kind of a grade do we deserve after over 200
Well,
years?
I think we deserve a pretty high grade. But as I said, I think that creed is rooted and was a product of this Anglo-Protestant culture. Now, if the culture disappears, I'm not sure how long the creed will last. If we divide up into a society with many different cultures, we probably will end up with many different creeds.
Is it a better culture if it's a Protestant culture than if it's a Catholic culture?
I'm not. They're just. I think there are differences. I'm not going to say one is better than the other. Obviously, I don't think it is. But I think our culture has been a Protestant culture, and I think one can see the extent to which the Catholics coming into this country, the Catholic immigration beginning in the mid-19th century, tried to adapt to this Protestant culture in a variety of ways, and in part did it by creating their own set of schools, institutions, and so forth. But in the end, you had what one can describe, I think, as the Protestantization of Catholicism in the United States, and the Catholics and Catholic institutions adapted to this society. And of course, by the 20th century, Catholics were among the most nationalistic of Americans. And this type of adaptation, I think, is something that one can see going on also in other societies.
What does it mean to be Protestant?
Well, let me make a distinction between Protestantism in the sense of religion, whether one is a Presbyterian or Episcopalian or Baptist or so forth and so on, which is not the way I was using it in terms of talking about Anglo-Protestant culture. I was talking about a set of values and customs and beliefs which are the product of the settlers, and which obviously are adhered to, were adhered to by people who were Protestant, but they are also that's a culture that can be absorbed and by other people. It's not limited to Protestants. When I've talked about my ideas with Jewish friends and talked about Anglo-Protestant culture, they very frequently say, "Oh yes, of course, and I'm an Anglo-Protestant Jew." And that's that's the overwhelming case.
Well, define what an Anglo is.
Well, now wait a second. You say Anglo.
Yeah, when you say Anglo-Protestant, I just define what an Anglo is, just so that I ask you what a Protestant is.
Well, that reflects the British, English, primarily English heritage of this country, beginning with our language, but also our legal institutions, political institutions, law. So many of our customs were derived from England because it was the English who came here.
Some might be listening and saying, well, okay, Anglo-Protestantism got us the British Empire worldwide, and the way that the British...
Didn't get us, it got the British Empire.
Well, that's what I mean. Well,
Okay.
You know, got the world is what I don't mean just Americans, got the world. And is that something to be proud of?
I don't understand.
But having an empire, I mean, controlling people's lives and telling them exactly how to live. They didn't live in democracies.
That's of course. I'm not going to. I think it would be most unfortunate if America became an imperial country. I think we look at the experience of the British Empire. The British made tremendous contributions to many of the countries whom they had as colonies, like India, for instance. But that's not something that can be sustained and shouldn't be sustained. And I don't think America should be move out into an imperial role. Now, there's a lot of talk recently about the American Empire, and some people embrace the idea. But I think that's something we should avoid. If we have to intervene overseas, it should be for limited purposes, and we should get out. I don't think it's the right thing for us to do. I think we ought to cultivate our own society, our own institutions, and not try to go off and shape in any sort of sustained way the institutions in other societies. I do think we have an interest in trying to encourage movements in other societies to promote democracy in those societies, but I think democracy, if it's going to come to other societies, in almost all cases, with a few exceptions, has to have indigenous sources. That's not something you can impose from the outside.
Before this is over, I have to ask you to tell the story because as a mild-mannered man sitting in front of me, I read the story about you taking on the mugger. The story of the mugger and who took you and attacked you and your wife. How many years ago did this happen?
Oh, that was years and years ago. I don't think I could fight off a mugger now.
What were the circumstances?
Well, we were had been at a dinner party in Cambridge, in one of the nicest areas of Cambridge, and with a friend, we were walking back to our car, and these two young men came up and said, money. And we said, what? What do you mean, money? We want your money. And then they attacked us.
Were you surprised at your ability to fight them off?
Well, I don't know. I don't think the important thing was physically, these three middle-aged people physically fighting these young men was important. But what I did was to start shouting at the top of my voice, "Help, police, call the police, help, police, call the police." And you saw lights go on in all the houses along the street, and people obviously called the police because the police got there in a couple of minutes or so. I think our attackers realized that would happen and made off.
What was your wife's profession over these years?
Well, she has been involved in as a staff person in politics. She worked in the mayor's office in Boston as a special assistant to our friend Kevin White, who for 16 years was mayor of Boston, and then she has also worked at directing programs at the Kennedy School of Government, executive programs for officials from the U.S. government and from foreign governments.
How long do you want to teach?
Well, I'll continue. I have no immediate intentions of retiring. I think I probably will want to give it up at some point, and should give it up at some point.
I know you just finished this book. Do you have another book you're working on?
Not at the moment. Nope.
And you've been over the years when you write, you get criticized. I mean, you clash with people.
That's right.
How do you like that?
Well, I don't particularly like the criticism, but as I indicated earlier, it seems to me that with several of my previous books, which were heavily criticized, in the end they came to receive the recognition which they deserved and were hailed as very important works. And as I said, I think that's because what I tend to do is to look at things and see them somewhat differently than other people do, and see things that people want to avoid. I wrote a book called Political Order in Changing Society in the 1960s, which said, hey, this whole idea that modernization and development are proceeding apace in the third world countries isn't holding up. We're not having political development, we're having political decay. And that book was criticized greatly when it first came out, but then in a few years it became the most widely used book in comparative politics courses in the United States, and it was all heralded as the book you had to read on that subject.
We're out of time. Here's the cover of the book. Who Are We? The challenge to America's national identity. Our guest has been Dr. Samuel P. Huntington. We thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Delighted to be here.
For a DVD or videotape, call 1-877-ON-C-SPAN. For a free transcript or to learn more about Booknotes, visit us at booknotes.org.